He walked into his own bank undercover just to see how his staff treated customers. But when they denied him service, what happened next shocked everyone. The towering glass facade of Grand Trust Bank gleamed under the afternoon sun, its sleek design symbolizing success, wealth, and opportunity. But for Marcus Bennett, the man who had built this financial empire from scratch, today wasn't about admiring the architecture. It was about uncovering the truth. Dressed in a simple hoodie, worn jeans, and an old baseball cap, Marcus didn't look like the billionaire CEO he was. He looked like an ordinary man, maybe even someone struggling to get by. And that was exactly the point. For months, Marcus had heard rumors about discriminatory practices in some of his bank branches, unjustified loan denials, biased service, and customers being treated differently based on how they looked. His executives dismissed these claims, calling them overblown or isolated incidents. But Marcus knew better. As a black man, he'd faced prejudice before, even when wearing his finest suit. But now, as the CEO of one of the largest banks in the country, he wanted to see firsthand if his staff treated people differently when they thought no one important was watching. As he walked through the bank's double-glass doors, he felt the cool blast of air conditioning hit his face. The lobby was bright, modern, and busy. Customers lined up at teller windows, while others waited patiently to speak with bankers at their desks. Marcus stepped into line, invisible among the crowd. Or so he thought. When it was finally his turn, he approached the teller, a middle-aged woman with a name tag that read, Susan. She barely looked up as he greeted her. "Hi, I'd like to withdraw some money from my account," Marcus said politely, sliding his bank card and ID across the counter. Susan glanced at the ID briefly, her eyes narrowing as she looked back at Marcus. Her smile faded. "Are you sure you have an account here?" she asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I'm sure." Susan sighed, tapping at her keyboard with deliberate slowness. After a few moments, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I can't process this transaction. Something doesn't add up." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "That's my ID, and I have more than enough in that account." Susan's eyes hardened. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you're not a legitimate customer, we can't assist you." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. Denied service at his own bank, not because of any issue with his account, but because of how he looked. But Susan wasn't done. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to be condescending. "Maybe you should try a different bank. This isn't the place for people like you." Marcus stood there, stunned into silence. The bustling lobby around him faded into the background as he processed her words. She had no idea she was talking to the man who owned the very bank she worked for. But she was about to find out. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He'd faced discrimination before, but this was personal. It wasn't just about him. It was about every customer who might have walked into this branch and been treated the same way. But instead of reacting immediately, Marcus decided to see how far it would go. "I'd like to speak to a manager," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the growing anger in his chest. Susan scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Sir, I don't think that's necessary. You need to leave before we call security." Marcus didn't move. "I said I'd like to speak to a manager." Susan huffed dramatically and waved over a man in a sharp suit standing near the back offices. His name tag read, Richard, Branch Manager. Richard approached with an air of authority, but barely concealed annoyance, glancing Marcus up and down before even speaking. "What seems to be the problem here?" Richard asked, addressing Susan rather than Marcus. "This gentleman is trying to withdraw money, but his account doesn't seem legitimate," Susan said quickly, her voice dripping with false professionalism. "I've already explained that we can't process it, but he insists on speaking to you." Richard turned to Marcus, his expression cold and dismissive. "Sir, if you don't have proper credentials, I'm afraid there's nothing we can do. We don't tolerate fraudulent activity here." Marcus felt his heart pound in his chest, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of what he was witnessing. He handed Richard his bank card and ID, the same one Susan had just dismissed. "Everything you need is right there," Marcus said quietly. Richard barely glanced at the documents before pushing them back toward Marcus. "This isn't going to work here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. The lobby had grown quieter, a few nearby customers sensing something was wrong but unsure of what. Finally, Marcus stepped back, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. "Hey, it's Marcus Bennett," he said when the line picked up. "I'm at the downtown branch. Can you meet me in the lobby in 5 minutes? We've got a situation." Susan and Richard exchanged confused glances, but neither of them had any idea what was coming. Marcus tucked his phone away and stood there, waiting. 5 minutes later, the regional director, Linda Roberts, walked through the front doors, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was flanked by 2 security officers, but the moment she saw Marcus, her face lit up in recognition. "Mr. Bennett," she exclaimed, rushing over. "I had no idea you were visiting today." The color drained from both Susan's and Richard's faces. Linda turned to them, her smile fading into a sharp, professional glare. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus didn't need to say a word. The look of horror on Susan's and Richard's faces said it all. They had just denied service to the CEO of the bank, and they were about to face the consequences. The color had completely drained from Susan's and Richard's faces. Richard's confident posture collapsed into stiff unease, while Susan clutched the edge of the counter, her mouth slightly open but unable to form any words. Linda, still waiting for an explanation, looked from Marcus to the 2 employees. When neither spoke, Marcus finally broke the silence. "I came here today to see how my customers are treated," he began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "And what I experienced wasn't just bad service. It was blatant discrimination." Linda's eyes widened, and she turned sharply toward Richard. "Is this true?" Richard stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. I didn't realize—" Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "That's the problem. You didn't realize because you didn't care to. You looked at me, made assumptions, and treated me like I didn't belong here. But let me make one thing very clear." He stepped forward, his gaze fixed firmly on Richard and Susan. "I built this bank. I own this bank. And no one should ever be treated the way you treated me today." A hush fell over the entire lobby. Customers who had been watching quietly now whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. Susan finally found her voice, though it trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Bennett, I didn't mean any disrespect. I was just following protocol." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Protocol? Is it protocol to tell someone this isn't the place for people like you? Because that's what you said to me." Susan's face went pale again, and she looked desperately to Richard for support. But Richard was already backing away, realizing that there was no saving this situation. Linda stepped in, her voice icy and professional. "Susan, Richard, your behavior is unacceptable and goes against everything this company stands for. Effective immediately, you are both terminated." Susan gasped. "Please, I didn't know." "That's exactly the point," Marcus interjected. "You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with basic respect." Security approached, gently guiding Susan and Richard toward the exit as they muttered weak apologies. But Marcus didn't even glance at them. His focus was on the employees and customers left behind. "To everyone here," he said, raising his voice so it carried across the room, "I apologize for what you witnessed today. This is not the standard of Grand Trust Bank. We will be taking immediate steps to ensure that every single person who walks through our doors is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The lobby erupted in applause. Even customers who had no idea who Marcus was before now stood in admiration, grateful to see someone at the top holding people accountable. But for Marcus, this was just the beginning. Because what he had uncovered today wasn't just about 2 bad employees, it was about making sure that no one in his company ever felt like they didn't belong again. The applause in the lobby slowly faded, but the impact of the moment lingered in the air. Marcus stood tall, scanning the faces of the employees and customers who had witnessed everything. Some looked inspired, others still shocked, but all of them knew they had just seen something unforgettable. Marcus turned to Linda, his voice steady but carrying the weight of responsibility. "I want a full audit of this branch," he instructed. "Every complaint, every incident report, dig it all up. If this happened to me, imagine how many others have faced the same treatment." Linda nodded, already pulling out her phone to begin coordinating. "Consider it done, Mr. Bennett." But Marcus wasn't finished. He turned back to the employees who remained at their desks and behind the counters, their eyes wide with uncertainty. "I know some of you are probably wondering what happens next," he began, addressing them directly. "Let me make this clear. This isn't just about firing 2 people and moving on. This is about changing the culture of this bank. And that starts today." The room was silent, every ear tuned to his words. "Starting now," Marcus continued, "we'll be implementing mandatory training on bias awareness, customer service, and professional ethics. Not because I expect you to be perfect, but because I expect you to be better." He paused, letting that sink in. "You will treat every customer, whether they're depositing $100 or $1 million, with the same level of respect. No assumptions, no judgments, just fairness and professionalism." A few employees nodded, visibly relieved that this wasn't just about punishment, it was about progress. But then, Marcus shifted his attention to the customers. "To those of you standing here today," he said, his voice softening slightly, "I know some of you might have been treated unfairly before. And for that, I'm deeply sorry. This bank was founded on the belief that everyone deserves equal access to financial services, regardless of who they are or what they look like. We lost sight of that here, but I promise you, we're getting it back." Another round of applause erupted, louder and more heartfelt than before. Some customers even approached Marcus personally, shaking his hand and thanking him for standing up. But the story didn't end there. The aftermath word of the incident spread quickly. By the next day, news outlets were covering the story of the black CEO who went undercover at his own bank and exposed discrimination from within. Social media lit up with praise, with hashtags like #CEO Justice and #Banking Reform trending across platforms. Customers from other branches began sharing their own stories of mistreatment, and Marcus made sure every complaint was investigated thoroughly. But perhaps the most unexpected twist came a week later. Marcus received an anonymous letter in the mail. It wasn't from a customer or an employee. It was from Susan, the former teller. In the letter, she apologized for her behavior, admitting that her biases and prejudices had been ingrained in her for years. But seeing Marcus's calm, dignified response had forced her to reflect on her actions. "I never realized how blind I was to my own ignorance," the letter read. "Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to change." Marcus folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, a reminder that real change wasn't just about policies, it was about people. And from that day forward, Grand Trust Bank became a symbol of not just financial success, but social responsibility. A place where everyone was welcome and no one was judged by anything but the content of their character. Have you ever faced unfair treatment in a place where you expected respect? Share your experience in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this.